The relationship between Richard and Clara had always been unconventional. Richard, a wealthy 55-year-old business mogul, had an eye for much younger women, and Clara was no exception. At just 22, Clara was a university student with dreams of making it big in the fashion industry. When she met Richard at an upscale event, she saw him as a ticket to financial security, while he viewed her as his prize, a beautiful young woman to flaunt at parties and behind closed doors. Their arrangement was simple. Richard showered Clara with lavish gifts, vacations, and financial support, and in return, Clara entertained his possessive affections. But what had started as a mutual exchange soon turned into something far more insidious. Richard's admiration turned into an obsession. He began monitoring her every move, demanding to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing. His love became suffocating, and Clara began to feel like a prisoner in a gilded cage. One evening, after Clara had returned from a weekend away with friends, something that had made Richard furious, he decided he could no longer tolerate sharing her with anyone else. He suggested they move in together, presenting the offer as a solution to her constant financial worries. Clara, increasingly uncomfortable with Richard's controlling nature, declined politely, hoping to let him down gently. But Richard wasn't ready to let go. His obsessive mind had already been formulating a darker plan, one that would ensure Clara would never leave his grasp. On a stormy night in the middle of October, Richard invited Clara to his penthouse for dinner, apologizing for his recent outbursts and promising a fresh start. Clara, believing that perhaps they could part ways amicably, agreed. She arrived at his opulent residence, greeted by soft candlelight and a table set for two. Richard appeared calm, almost too calm, as they sat down to a meticulously prepared meal. As they ate, Richard made small talk, but the atmosphere felt wrong, tense. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she dismissed it as nerves. She had to find the right moment to tell him that she wanted to end their arrangement, for good. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Richard poured them both glasses of wine. As Clara sipped hers, she felt the weight of his gaze on her. Finally, she gathered the courage to speak. "Richard, I think we need to talk." He smiled faintly, his eyes betraying a coldness she hadn't seen before. "I know, Clara. I've been thinking a lot about us too." Before Clara could respond, she felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her. She blinked, her vision blurring as her head grew heavy. What did you do?" she whispered, struggling to keep her balance. Richard stood, watching her impassively. "You'll thank me, Clara. Now, you'll never leave me." Clara's body gave out, and she collapsed onto the couch, barely able to move. She realized with horror that he had drugged her. The room spun around her as Richard knelt beside her, stroking her hair with a chilling tenderness. "You belong to me, Clara. I can't let you go." As she drifted in and out of consciousness, Richard revealed his plan. He had decided they would be together forever, in life or in death. He had prepared everything, down to the smallest detail. He would take her somewhere secluded, away from the world, where they could live in peace. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she fought to stay awake, but the drug was too powerful. The last thing she saw was Richard calmly picking up his phone, dialing someone, and uttering the words, "It's time." When Clara woke up, she was in the back seat of a car, her wrists bound and her head pounding. She looked out the window and saw only darkness, broken by the occasional flash of headlights on the highway. Richard was driving, humming softly to himself. Clara's mind raced. She had to find a way to escape. She tried to loosen the bindings around her wrists, but it was no use. As the car sped down the empty road, panic gripped her. But she knew one thing. She had to outsmart him. "Richard." Her voice was weak, but she forced herself to speak. "Please, just stop. We can work things out." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his face devoid of emotion. "It's too late for that, Clara. We're meant to be together. Forever." As the car pulled into a remote cabin deep in the woods, Clara's hope began to dwindle. Richard was too far gone, his obsession now a terrifying, twisted version of love. He dragged her inside, still calm, still convinced that this was the only way they could be together. But what Richard hadn't accounted for was the resolve growing inside Clara. As he prepared for what he called their final night together, Clara, despite her weakened state, made her move. She waited until his back was turned and grabbed the closest object she could reach, a heavy candlestick. Summoning all her strength, she struck him over the head. Richard staggered, blood trickling down his face, but his obsession wouldn't let him fall. He lunged at her, and in the ensuing struggle, they both collapsed onto the floor. It was then that Clara, driven by survival, grabbed the candlestick once more and delivered the final blow. Richard lay still, his once obsessive gaze now lifeless. Clara, shaking and covered in blood, stood over him, realizing the nightmare was finally over. Clara sat in the back of the police cruiser, numb and exhausted, watching the flashing lights of the ambulances and patrol cars dance in the reflection of the rain-soaked cabin. Her wrists, still raw from the bindings Richard had used, rested on her lap. She stared at them, struggling to comprehend the events of the last 24 hours. She had killed a man, her sugar daddy, her tormentor, the one who had claimed to love her. The paramedics had checked her over, but physically she was fine, just bruised and shaken. The real trauma, however, was the kind that didn't show on the surface. Richard's death felt surreal, and the weight of what she had done hadn't fully settled in. Part of her couldn't believe it was over, while another part knew it was only the beginning of a new nightmare. The legal consequences, the questions, the headlines. As the cruiser pulled away from the cabin, Clara caught one last glimpse of Richard's body being loaded into the coroner's van. His face was covered now, the finality of death stripping away any trace of the obsessive lover who had once controlled every aspect of her life. But even in death, he felt like a presence that would haunt her forever. By the time they reached the police station, Clara's mind was spiraling. The officers, though sympathetic, treated her cautiously. After all, a dead man was involved, and her story, no matter how clear to her, needed to be picked apart, examined from every angle. Detective Grace Mitchell was assigned to Clara's case. A sharp, middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, she led Clara to a small interrogation room and sat down across from her, a recording device already set in the middle of the table. Mitchell's eyes were steady, assessing. "Clara," she began softly, flipping through a file of notes, "I need you to walk me through everything again, from the beginning." Clara's throat felt tight, but she nodded. She began recounting the tale, from her first meeting with Richard to the gradual shift in his behavior, how what had been an arrangement of convenience turned into a dark, possessive nightmare. She told Mitchell about the night at the cabin, the drugs in her wine, and how she'd fought for her life in those final terrifying moments. As Clara spoke, she found herself watching Mitchell's face, searching for signs of doubt or disbelief. But Mitchell simply listened, her pen occasionally scratching notes. "And you're sure you were unconscious in the car?" Mitchell asked, her tone neutral. Clara nodded. "I woke up when we were almost there. I I think he was planning to keep me there forever. Mitchell didn't flinch. Forever? What do you mean? Clara swallowed hard, remembering Richard's twisted words. He said we were meant to be together. He didn't want me to leave. I think he meant to keep me there, against my will. The detective leaned back slightly, tapping her pen against the table. So, when you hit him, it was self-defense? Clara hesitated, her stomach twisting. Yes, it was. He was going to kill me, or worse. I had no choice. Mitchell's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before she stood up and left the room, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. The silence pressed in on her, and suddenly, the full weight of the situation crashed down on her chest. Would they believe her? Hours passed, and Clara found herself sitting in a holding cell. Though she hadn't been charged with anything yet, the waiting gnawed at her nerves. She had called her mother, leaving out the worst details, only saying she'd been in a terrible situation and needed a lawyer. Her mother, panicked and confused, promised to send someone immediately. As she waited, flashes of Richard's face, both alive and dead, flickered in her mind. She could still hear his voice, could still feel his hand brushing her cheek that night at the cabin, his touch that once felt like safety, turning into a source of terror. The door to the cell clanged open. Mitchell stood in the doorway. "Your lawyer's here," she said simply, her expression unreadable. Clara followed her to a small meeting room, where a woman in a sharp suit stood waiting. Alice Halloway, her name was, a defense attorney known for her skill in dealing with high-profile cases. Clara had seen her name in the papers before, usually tied to cases involving the wealthy and powerful. She was exactly who Clara needed. "Clara," Alice said, shaking her hand firmly, "I've been briefed on your situation. We'll get through this. Just tell me everything, exactly as it happened." Clara nodded, relief washing over her as she sat down and began the story once more. Alice listened intently, occasionally interrupting with questions, her legal mind already forming a defense strategy. "Self-defense is the key here," Alice said firmly once Clara had finished. "From everything you've told me, it's clear you acted out of fear for your life. We'll need to establish Richard's pattern of obsessive behavior, any evidence that supports his intent to harm or control you. Do you have any messages or emails that show this?" Clara thought back, recalling the countless texts Richard had sent her, the controlling demands, the jealous outbursts. "Yes," she said slowly. "I saved a lot of them." "Good," Alice replied. "We'll need all of that. It'll help paint the picture of a man whose obsession crossed into dangerous territory." The following weeks were a blur of legal meetings, media attention, and a growing sense of dread. News outlets latched onto the story. Sugar daddy murdered by young lover in grisly cabin attack, painting Clara as either a victim or a calculating killer, depending on the day's headline. The prosecution, led by an ambitious district attorney, argued that Clara had manipulated Richard from the start, playing him for his wealth and power, before turning on him when it suited her. They portrayed her as a cold-hearted young woman who had lured an older man into a fatal trap. But Alice was relentless in her defense. She gathered testimony from Clara's friends, building a picture of a young woman who had been drawn into a dangerous relationship, one that spiraled into obsession. She presented the text messages as evidence of Richard's controlling behavior, showing how his love had twisted into something far more sinister. The trial was emotionally exhausting for Clara. She had to relive that night over and over, facing the cold stares of the courtroom, the judgmental eyes of strangers who had only seen the headlines. But through it all, Alice remained a steady force, pushing back against every accusation with sharp precision. In the end, after weeks of testimony and grueling cross-examinations, the jury reached its verdict. Clara sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest, as the foreman stood and read the words that would decide her fate. Not guilty. A gasp rippled through the courtroom, and Clara's hands flew to her mouth in shock. Tears filled her eyes as Alice gave her a small, triumphant smile. The ordeal was over. She was free. But as Clara walked out of the courtroom that day, the sunlight feeling foreign on her skin, she knew that even though she had escaped prison, she would never truly be free from Richard's shadow. His obsession had ended, but its darkness lingered, a stain she could never fully wash away. In the months following the trial, Clara tried to rebuild her life, but it felt like walking through the rubble of something permanently shattered. She moved back to her small apartment, avoiding the places she used to frequent with Richard. The media frenzy had subsided, but whispers still followed her wherever she went. Strangers recognized her from the news, their judgmental stares and hushed conversations, a constant reminder that her name had been forever tied to the man she had killed. Though legally exonerated, Clara remained trapped in the emotional aftermath of Richard's obsession. Her days were spent in quiet isolation, trying to pick up the pieces. She had quit school for the time being, unable to focus on anything but the overwhelming weight of guilt and freedom. Freedom. It was ironic, she thought. Richard was gone, but his presence still loomed over her, as suffocating in death as it had been in life. Alice Holloway, the lawyer who had saved her from prison, checked in occasionally. While their professional relationship had ended, Alice seemed to understand that Clara needed someone who didn't see her as either the victim or the villain. Alice saw her as what she truly was, a survivor. One afternoon, a few months after the verdict, Clara received a letter. It had no return address, but the handwriting was familiar. Her heart raced as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line written in bold, neat script. "We're not done yet." Clara's hands shook as she dropped the letter, her pulse thundering in her ears. It couldn't be from Richard. He was dead. She had seen his lifeless body, heard the thud of the candlestick as it struck him. She had watched as his blood stained the floor. But someone knew. Someone wanted her to remember that night, to remind her that she would never truly escape what had happened in that cabin. Panic seized her, and she paced her apartment, trying to calm the rising tide of fear. Was it a sick prank? A twisted reminder of the trial's notoriety? She didn't know. But whoever had sent it, the message was clear. Her nightmare wasn't over. Clara debated whether to tell Alice, but part of her knew there was little the lawyer could do. The law had cleared her name, but no one could protect her from the invisible ghosts of her past. She shoved the letter into a drawer, trying to convince herself it was meaningless, that it was just some cruel joke. A few weeks passed, and Clara's unease began to fade. She told herself that the letter had been a one-time event, probably someone trying to scare her for attention. But late one evening, as she walked home from the grocery store, she had the eerie sensation of being followed. The street was empty, but Clara's every instinct screamed danger. She quickened her pace, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the deserted alleyway. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows. A man, his face obscured by a hood, stood directly in her path. Clara froze, fear coursing through her veins. "Clara," the man said, in a low, chilling voice, "I told you we're not done." Before she could react, he lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. She struggled, but his grip was like iron. Panic exploded inside her as she tried to break free, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you? What do you want?" she gasped, her voice trembling. The man leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear. "You ruined everything. Richard wasn't the only one watching you." Clara's mind raced. Was this someone connected to Richard? A former business partner? An acquaintance? Or someone just as obsessed with her as Richard had been? But before he could say another word, the screech of car tires tore through the night. Headlights illuminated the alley, and the man released her, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. Clara staggered backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. A car door slammed, and Alice's familiar voice called out, "Clara, are you okay?" Clara couldn't believe her eyes. Alice stood there, looking both furious and concerned, holding a phone in one hand and scanning the street for signs of the attacker. "I got a call from an unknown number," Alice said, hurrying over to Clara. "Someone told me to find you here. Something about Richard's unfinished business. I came as fast as I could." Clara, still shaking, could barely process what had just happened. He said Richard wasn't the only one obsessed with me." Alice's expression darkened. "We need to report this. You're not safe." Back at the police station, Clara gave her statement, describing the man and the threatening message he'd delivered. But there wasn't much to go on. No one knew who the man was, or what he truly wanted. The police promised to investigate, but Clara knew that they wouldn't find him. He was just a shadow, part of the web Richard had spun around her, a ghost sent to remind her that her past would never let her go. Months passed, and the incident in the alley faded into memory, though it never truly left Clara's mind. She tried to move on, to live her life beyond the trauma of Richard's obsession. But the shadows lingered, always, just at the edges of her vision, reminding her that some stories don't have clean endings. One evening, as Clara sat on her balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, her phone buzzed with a new message. Her heart skipped a beat as she unlocked it, the familiar dread creeping back. It was a single text. No sender, no context, just one word: forever. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the screen. The shadow of Richard's obsession still clung to her, and she realized, with chilling clarity, that some scars never heal, and some obsessions never die. She closed her phone and turned to the darkness, knowing that it would always be there, watching.